Caution: this video contains scenes of mathematics which may disturb sensitive viewers. In the last video, I told you about some of the applications of computational mechanics simulation. Mathematically, these models can be expressed as partial differential equations in spatial coordinates, 2-dimensional or 3 dimensions. To explain how a computer can be used to numerically solve such equations, we will look at a simple example, the 2-dimensional Laplace equation, which represents heat conduction in a metal plate. It is of course possible to solve this simple equation analytically and obtain an exact solution. However, it is useful to explain how to solve it numerically by means of a finite difference approximation technique. When you were taught differential calculus, you determined the gradient by looking at the change in some function of x, say y, over a small variation in x, we call it delta x, and then letting delta x tend towards 0, or being infinitely small. Computers can't deal with infinitely small numbers. However, we can get a reasonably good approximation of the gradient by making x small but finite. This is called finite differencing. So what we do is to divide the computational domain, that's the area that we're interested in trying to simulate, up into a finite grid. The temperature gradient in the plate, in the case of our Laplace equation example, can then be approximated at any point as the difference in temperature between that point and a neighboring point on the grid. We can then take the gradient as approximated on either side of a single point and take the difference between these two in order to get the second derivative, as the equation is expressed in terms of second derivatives. If we now substitute the finite difference approximation into the original equation for each point on the grid, we have a set of simultaneous equations in temperature. And in other words, if we solve that, we can determine the temperature at each grid point. For each grid point is only influenced by the temperature at the grid point itself and its nearest neighbors. Therefore, if we were to write out the set of simultaneous equations in the form of a matrix, you would find that most of the matrix would actually be full of zeros, and the non-zero values all occur more or less along the main diagonal of the matrix. This is what is called a sparse matrix, and this is important when it comes to solving the system of linear equations in the matrix numerically on a computer. The resulting solution, remember, is a numerical approximation. It's not exact, but it is good enough to give engineers and applied scientists an answer which can allow them to make an informed design decision. By making the grid finer for a given domain and including more grid points, we can get better numerical accuracy for a given problem. Now comes the rub. The partial differential equation that governs fluid mechanics, the Navier-Stokes equation, is so complex that it is actually one of the Millennium Challenges, which is to say if you can find a general analytical solution to it, you can win $1 million prize. Analytical solutions are possible for certain special cases if you throw away certain terms, but that kind of defeats the object of having an exact solution, doesn't it? So, a numerical approximation of the solution to the governing equations of fluid flow has to be good enough. This is what computational fluid mechanics is. As many fluid mechanics problems are inherently 3-dimensional, we divide up the flow domain into 3-dimensional boxes rather than 2-dimensional squares, but the principle remains the same. In order to deal with the additional complexity of the Navier-Stokes equation, we then have to apply something called the Gauss divergence theorem in order to render the equations tractable for even numerical solution. Explained simply, what this does is to allow us to look at what is going into and out of each one of the rectangular areas or cells, rather than integrating over its entire volume, which is numerically expensive to do. That's enough maths for now.